I'm here with Dr. Jaime Pineda. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Sure. Glad to be here.
So I wanted to set a bit of context first for listeners for how this conversation came to be. Maybe about, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago is when we first met. I was a graduate student down in San Diego, and I believe I had approached you about a project I wanted to do in your lab because you were studying neurofeedback and biofeedback and had I think a postdoc at the time who was looking at these interventions in kids with autism, and I wanted to do a project. So anyways, long story short, I had approached you about that. We ended up working together for a number of years on a project using those two modalities in kids with autism. But what I think maybe planted the seed for our conversation today was, you don't know this, Jaime, but one time I stumbled into your office and I think I saw a poster or pamphlet or something for like a conference on science and spirituality, the confluence of those two things. I don't know if that rings any bells for you, but I was obviously automatically curious, and I know we never really had conversations about it back then, but I always wanted to have a conversation with you about the confluence of science and spirituality. So here we are today, and I'm so excited to be doing this. Take us back a little bit to actually, if it's okay with you, maybe we can go back very far, very early into childhood. I know a little bit about you having to leave your family, leave your culture behind, but I don't know a whole lot. And so I'm wondering if you can tell us about that experience as a 9-year-old, I believe, coming to the United States, and what that was like, maybe how that has shaped you today.
Sure. Well, so I was born in Honduras, Central America. My parents had family in the U.S., and they thought that it would be good for me to improve my education if I came to the U.S., learned English, and all that kind of stuff. So the goal was to send me and go to school through high school and then go back, right? But as it turned out, once you taste the the culture in the U.S. and all the opportunities, I didn't want to go back. But the reason why they did that was because I was, from the very beginning, a very curious child. I asked a lot of questions, and they thought that, being in the US would help me develop that ability. I think part of what happened was when you leave everything, I left my family, my culture, a new language, you lost all these things, and you had to essentially reinvent yourself, right? I mean, that's how I understood it. Here I am in a new environment, and I don't know who I am. The person that I was before isn't here anymore. And so it got me to thinking about the nature of personality, the nature of self. What is the real self if I can just move to another country and I become someone totally different, right? And so through high school and college, all these questions just kept coming up and coming up. What is the real nature? Who are you really? And so I began, to focus on those things. Who am I? What am I? And it led me into studying psychology, and then into neuroscience and so on. But what happened with that was that, science, I thought, would provide a lot of answers to those questions. And so that's one of the reasons why I thought, well, okay, I'll get into looking at biology and looking at neuroanatomy, and that can tell me a lot about who I am. And it did, to a great extent, it did. But then I reached a point where it didn't answer some of the questions, right? And then I began trying to go beyond those questions. And I realized that intellectual reasoning can take you so far in answering a lot of questions that we're all interested in about who we are, what we're doing in this world, and so forth. So I needed to find a different approach to find the answers besides, intellectual reasoning. And so I was introduced to meditation by a fellow student, and began practicing meditation, thinking that that was another way to understand the mind, understand, give me a different perspective. And so I started doing meditation, mindfulness meditation. I got into Zen Buddhism because I thought that seemed to be more in line with what I was thinking. Zen has a very scientific approach, I think, to understanding, from that perspective. So I became a student of a Zen teacher in San Diego for about 4 years, and practiced with her. She taught me a lot. But one of the things she taught me was, okay, at some point, you need to go beyond being with me as a teacher. You need to go on your own. You need to learn things. And the best teacher is life itself. And so she encouraged me to keep asking questions, and that life itself would challenge me and also provide some answers. And so I've been doing that since I stopped working with her in 1986, I think. So I've been essentially on my own, trying to do what she taught me.
So you're describing these two methods of inquiry into the nature of the mind that your curiosity was leading you to.
Yeah.
How are these ways of knowing different? And I guess, what are the limitations of both ways of inquiring into the nature of the mind? I think with science, you probably run into roadblocks, and maybe that's the case in your mindfulness practice as well.
Yeah. So the way I think of it is, science is very good at taking things apart, understanding the parts of a system. So you take biology and the human brain, and you take it all apart, and you find out that with this part of the brain does this thing, this other part does this thing, etc. We're very good. It's very good at that kind of understanding. But it's not very good at integration, at integrating all those parts into an understanding of the whole. On the other hand, spirituality is just that. It's the understanding of the whole that you get from spirituality, right? And so they're complementary. On the one hand, science gives you the parts, spirituality gives you the holistic understanding. And so I found out that, in fact, they are complementary, and you need to do both.
What has spirituality taught you about self and the nature of self that science hasn't, or just an ordinary experience in the world hasn't? And maybe if it would be helpful, can you define what you mean by self?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. So, but the way I view it is, there's a sense of who we are from the very beginning, a sense of identity from the time you're hours old or whatever, even before, that I think of as a sense of self. So there's already what some people have called the true self already there, right? A sense of who we are, that we're individuals, that we live in a world surrounded by other things, etc. But as we develop, that initial original sense of self develops what I have called in my book, I call it the virtual self. That is, we develop an avatar that plays ourselves. We play ourselves within our mind. We create this avatar that is this initial sense of who we are, in order to protect ourselves from things, right? The world is coming at us. The world is not very safe. There are a lot of dangers. And so we create an avatar that confronts that, right? And what happens, I think, is that this avatar is the sort of the coalition of thoughts and expectancies and schemas and things that we develop in order to deal with the world. And so here we are, we're creating all this sort of thing, this avatar, this virtual self. And then at some point we think that that's our real me, right? We forget that there is this other real self We think of this as the real me, and we begin to respond to the world from this thing, this virtual me. And so I think what spirituality has taught me is that it's important to begin to dissolve this virtual thing, right? Somehow to get rid of it, because behind it is the real you. Once you get rid of the cloud that's hiding the real thing, then you encounter the real you, the real me, whatever you want to call it. So I think of the self as there being a self. It's just being hidden by this virtual thing, right? And spirituality for me was the questioning that led me to all this, was that this was not real and I needed to somehow unpack it.
Why were you motivated to unpack it, or why should anyone be motivated to dissolve that cloud? What would be the advantage of that as a human being?
So, the true self, the thing that we really are, I think its nature is one of peace and calm and joy, right? And so what would happen to me is that during this time where I was practicing meditation and things like that, I had this cloud over me, but once in a while something would open up and then close again. And when it opened up a little bit, I could feel this other thing, this sense of joy and the sense of lack of fear, et cetera. And I began to think, the metaphor that came to mind was a rainy day. You're in a storm. You're down here on Earth, a storm. You think that everything is the storm and lightning and sounds and all that. But if you take an airplane and you go above the clouds, you realize there's sunshine. Not everything is the storm. And so that metaphor stuck with me. I thought, okay, maybe this thing that's clouding me is just the storm that's taking place. But if you get rid of it, there's the sunshine is there, right? Something else is there. And so, and like I said, every once in a while you get glimpses of it. And that's what motivated me. I think the glimpses that I got, little by little, the window started opening a bit, and you could sense that there was something else, something that you really wanted, that I really wanted to know and explore.
Yeah. So somehow being stuck in the clouds, being stuck in the identification with our self, little self or whatever, that creates suffering for us. Why are we so attached to it? Why don't we just go above the clouds or clear the clouds? Why are we all walking around with this avatar and completely just identified and in love with ourself, with the self that we identify with?
No, I mean, that's a great question. And I mean, the only answer I have is that most people never learn about this alternative, right? And part of it is because we identify so strongly with our thoughts. We identify so strongly with this cloud that we don't see an alternative. And unless you begin questioning that, unless you begin to ask, is that real? Is that the real me? And you're persistent in those questions, unfortunately, because this evolves from the very beginning. Remember, the avatar is created as a kind of protective mechanism. And so from the very beginning, it's there protecting you. So it's doing a good job. It does a good job. But then we begin to identify with it, and we don't realize that we could let it go, especially when you get older and you're able to protect yourself. You can let it go and things will be okay. But we've identified with it so much by that point that we have a hard time. That's me. And if I let it go, what am I going to be? Am I going to die? And those are the kind of questions a lot of beginners ask. Letting go of the self, does that cause me to sort of disappear? And my answer is no. All you're doing is opening it up, and there's the real you right there, right? So But I think it's the deep identification with thinking that is the problem initially.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you explain a little bit more how this was advantageous, maybe from like an evolutionary perspective, how this self came to be? You're describing it as protective, and it's a way for us to, yeah, be able to anticipate the future, reflect on the past. So because of that, because of those capacities of our mind, because we have language, we're able to go outside of the here and now, where there's no self, into this imaginary, okay, this is who I was yesterday and 10 years ago, and this is who I'm going to be. And that's our idea of self. And that can be very protective. But how do you understand the self from a evolutionary biological perspective?
So I think I think this creation of this imaginary thing is necessary at the very beginning, because when we're infants, we really have no control of the world, of the environment, of the things that can affect us, right? Uh, we have less control. We're dependent on parents to feed us. And if the parents don't feed us, it creates crises. And so, right? So imagine a young mind, dependent on parents who aren't there. And so you begin to form these defensive mechanisms to deal with those kinds of things, right? So the protectiveness of that initial self is evolutionarily critical. It's important because of the dependency we have. We have no control. Carl Jung said that what should happen is that at some point you realize that you have control now, and you're able to deal with problems, and you should then be able to let go of this ego, right? And this is his ego self-differentiation crisis that occurs. And for most people, it can set up an emotional crisis, a spiritual crisis, when you get to your 40s, maybe, or 30s or 40s or 50s, where you realize, I'm hanging on to all these things that aren't real, that aren't really protecting me, and I need to find something else more real, et cetera, et cetera. You begin questioning that cloud. And so he said that's a natural process, right? That's a natural process to get rid of that, dissolve this thing that we needed at the beginning, and to find the unity that was there from the very beginning. So I'm kind of more in that line of thinking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You mentioned having some sort of crisis in our life that is the antecedent to us maybe starting to dissolve the self, or be interested in looking at what is causing all the suffering in my life.
Right.
This is a very Jungian approach, but how would you understand these crises? I mean, do you look at them as opportunities, as gifts, in order for us to have some sort of transformation, whether we call that spiritual or however we sort of, whatever framework we use for it? But it's almost as if like, our body or whatever's happening in our life gets to a point where we have to take a look at what's not working, how am I contributing to this suffering, and then reorient our way of living. What's your take on that?
Well, I mean, there are two perspectives, right? One is from the holistic, real, true self, which is sitting back and saying, yes, here are these opportunities to grow, to find your true way, your way back to this unity that you experienced. That's one perspective. The other perspective is from the perspective of the small self, the virtual self. And it says, oh my God, this is a crisis, and I can't deal with it, and, et cetera, et cetera. So you have these two warring factions, I think, that develop. And so both are real, both are real. And for a lot of people, they fall prey to the little mind, and they don't follow through with the opportunities that are given. For a lot of other people, they do, and they decide no matter what the pain is, the pain that I'm feeling is more than than I can bear, and so I need to do something.
I'm wondering if we can pivot a little bit. I want to
Yeah.
get into the neurobiology of this thing called self. What about default mode network? Can you tell us what that network is? And then maybe we can speculate on how that's involved in the feeling of self.
So this is, I would say, a relatively different discovery, that we have these areas of the brain, primarily along the middle part of the brain from the front to the back, called the default mode network, that includes things like the anterior cingulate and the posterior cingulate, et cetera, the parietal areas and so forth. And as I understand it, what happens is that these are areas involved in what's called self-referential processing, or when you start thinking about yourself. So my understanding is that when your attention turns from looking at the outside world and it turns inward, and you begin to start thinking about yourself in relation to all your problems and things like that, that's when the default mode network comes online. You see activation in those areas. When you're wandering, your mind is wandering and not focused on anything, there's activity in the default mode network. So it's an important area, I think, for that kind of self-referential thing, and which I think is important. In my book, I think of it as part of what I call the monkey brain. It's the monkey brain being that aspect of your brain or your mind that just starts thinking about all sorts of things relative to yourself. And I think the default mode network is one of the bases for the monkey mind.
You mentioned your book, and I don't know if it's too early to mention because this is you haven't published it yet, but you are working on a book that is kind of showing how neuroscience and Zen practice can overlap and live in harmony with each other, and you give some very practical tips for people on how to quiet that monkey mind. So knowing what you know about monkey mind and default mode network and self, we could spend years and lifetimes talking about this, but what is your prescription for how to quiet those things, how to help people to find greater sense of ease and peace and relaxation in their life? Just kind of very, very broad brushstrokes.
Yeah. So the attempt, or the reason, my motivation for writing this book was to present some of the insights that I had. They may be wrong, they're my insights, combined with the neuroscience background that I had and what I understood, might be going on with the brain and so forth. And at the same time, I wanted to present a easy to do, easy solution. Are there easy solutions? I don't know, but the easiest solution that I could come up with is the following: you can get rid of your monkey mind very easily. All you have to do is really focus on the moment, the present moment. Part of the problem with the monkey mind is that it's based on memories and on future anticipation of things, the past and the future, right? The monkey mind deals with those things to solve problems. It has to think about what happened. It has to think of what's going to happen. And so the monkey mind is very much engaged in past and future.
It's like that self-protective mechanism.
I'm sorry.
It's like that self-protective mechanism that you were referring to. Yeah,
exactly. But the easiest way to get rid of it is simply come to the present, right? Excuse me. And when you do that, this stops the past, future what I call problem solving that the mind is trying to do stops. And you know, you can, anyone can try that. Simply try coming to the present moment and just being present at this moment, and you realize suddenly all your problems go away. Right? They aren't there in this present moment. You know, the worries about cancer, the fact that you're going to lose your job. If you come to this present moment, those aren't there. You know, and so the easiest and quickest way to get rid of this obsessive monkey mind is to do that, to practice being in the present. And we can go and talk about why that is, but basically the present moment is not based on memories, autobiographical memories. And therefore, when you do that, when you come to this, you disconnect with your memories of the past and the future kinds of things. You're simply in a moment where I call it a timeless moment. If you're really here in the present, you're in a timeless domain where memories like that don't exist, right? And so that's, I think, the basis for beginning to work out these issues, these problems. It doesn't make the problems disappear. What happens is that in the present moment, the problems become opportunities, right? So you don't see them as issues that you need to solve somehow. Suddenly they become opportunities for growth, right? And so you can go from there. But so that's sort of my basic argument.
Okay, I have 3 questions about
Okay.
that. So let's see if we can address all of them. So maybe the first one's maybe not so much a question unless you want to respond to it. But you were saying that when you're in the present moment, your problems aren't problems, but opportunities. So it's almost as if, like, you know, when we're not in the present moment, we experience our problems as threats. They're things that need to be solved. They're threats to ourselves, to our survival and well-being. And therefore, they're more likely to stimulate the threat systems in our brain and our fight or flight or sympathetic nervous system, whatever it is. And that, as we know, can have really detrimental effects for our mental health, for our physical health, that constant wear and tear. How is it that when we're in the present moment and we notice our problems, how is it that changes the problem into an opportunity for growth? Is it just a shift in our mindset? Are we shifting into some other neurobiological state where we're not in a state of fear, but in a state of maybe not avoidance, but approach? Or I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
You know, part of what I've experienced is when I am in the present moment, I suddenly am less fearful about things, right? So you disconnect with, like you were saying, from these emotional systems that create fear and anxiety and things like that. And so imagine if you have a problem, but you don't have that fear about that problem or that anxiety about that problem, suddenly the problem looks different, right? It looks, like I said, more like an opportunity. So here's a simple example. Say you're a student, right? You're a student and you're supposed to write a paper for a teacher, and it's due, the next day. Most people go into this panic mode, right? Anxiety about having to do research and write and et cetera. But if you take this approach, if you're in the present moment, you realize that, if you're not afraid of it, you actually see it as an opportunity to maybe learn about something new, right? It's an opportunity to grow and experience something, do research on something you didn't know about, right? So that's the basic idea. So by removing the fear and anxiety, suddenly it looks different. The problem looks different. It looks more like an opportunity for growing.
Second question I have is, okay, so someone's listening and they've tried meditating, they've
Yeah.
tried to quiet the monkey mind, and they say, well, yeah, I really want to be present. I know that I just need to let go of my problems. But I've meditated, I've tried every technique, and I just can't seem to be present. Um, and again, I mean, we're talking about maybe lifetimes of of work on this, but I don't know if someone came to you and they were saying, well, and they're feeling pessimistic or just really struggling, what advice would you give them?
Well, the first thing is to understand that the state that I'm talking about, being in the present moment, isn't a fancy, unique, novel thing that occurs. It happens to you all the time. You're just not aware of it, right? So imagine that you're reading a book, right? And you get into the book so much that you lose a sense of your environment. You know, you're so much into the story that you forget about time and you forget about lunch and, you know, et cetera, right? That's the present moment. You are so focused on that thing that you're doing that you lose a sense of time and other realities. You're looking at, let's say you're at the beach and you see a beautiful sunset, and suddenly, you know, you stop thinking about other things except that beautiful sunset. So these are things that occur to people all the time, right? They reach that state of being in the present moment. It's just that it only lasts a short time.
Mm-hmm.
And so the key then is to try to think about those moments and think about how can I extend them. You know, what is it that I need to do to extend this sense of oneness with this sunset that suddenly captured all my attention? You know, how do I do that? And that's where the practice comes in. You know, it's not a given. You do have to practice because your mind is, you know, going all over the place. But when you quiet that mind a little bit, those moments, that window gets bigger and 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 bigger. And then at some point you reach a point where, you know, you feel like, okay, wow, I'm here, right? That, you know, that's my understanding. And you know, I've experienced some of it where, you know, I am longer and longer in moments where, and life at that point is like I said, is like looking at a beautiful sunset. It becomes very beautiful, very joyful, and so on. Yeah.
I think a lot of people feel like they're worried that if I were just to be present all the time, that I wouldn't get anything done, or I wouldn't be able to solve my problems, or, um, you know, go to work every day and pay my taxes and deal with all the things I have to deal with. What would you say to that?
Yeah, and that's a misconception, a misunderstanding of what it is that we're talking about, because what we're talking about here is really going from a state of what I call conscious awareness, where you're aware of all your problems, to this other state, um, which I associate with non-conscious awareness, right? Where you know, you're not focused on an object, your window is much more open, you're focused on something else. And my sense is that this non-conscious, this bigger thing that we have, is a much more intelligent thing than we realize. There's an intelligence behind that. And so when you try to reach that point, you actually access more intelligence than you had before. And the problems, which are now more like opportunities, you know, are addressed by this more intelligent sense of being, right? So in what I'm arguing is that the fear of losing that is totally uncalled for. In fact, you're going to find more resources, better resources to address your problems, which are now more like opportunity than before. So,
Do you think there's something intelligent outside of our awareness that's guiding us, that's giving us these opportunities, these problems on purpose? There's some meaning, or there's some purpose behind it. And if so, how can we trust that thing
Yeah,
more?
right. And so that's the key question. How do we trust that? And so first of all, let's start with what I call a non-conscious processes. Most of what we do, we're not aware of, right? We're only aware of a very small part of what's happening. Even at this moment, you're sitting there. Are you aware of sitting on a chair and how that feels and how your feet are resting on the ground? Are you aware of the sounds outside? Normally we're not. We filter all that out and we're only aware of a very small portion, let alone imagine inside your body, something is taking care of your internal temperature. Something is taking care of, the neurons, the 100 billion neurons and the neurochemistry that's necessary to maintain homeostasis, right? So 99% of what we are and what we do is beyond our awareness, right? And so this is what I mean by an intelligence behind it. That the fact that your body is doing all these things and you're not aware of, it's doing it because there's an intelligence there, right? Somehow it has to be, at least in my mind. And so accessing that or acknowledging that is the first step. Acknowledging that there is more to just simply being aware. There's something else that's going on, and not only in you, but in the universe, right? You're not aware of anything that's going on outside in the universe. The planets rotating around the sun, the supernova, et cetera, right? So there's a huge universe, which I think of as intelligent, that's beyond that. And so my sense is that it's useful to try to contact with that, to interconnect with that. And accessing that will give you some access to this more intelligent behavior.
That's actually really helpful for me. I like how you framed this with starting with recognizing just what's happening in the body at a very rudimentary level and knowing that there's all these unconscious processes taking place that I'm not aware of. That immediately gives me the sense of, wow, so whatever I think I am, my feeling of self, in my little bubble, that usually doesn't include like all the stuff that's happening in my body because I'm not aware of that. But I mean, I'm in my body, I'm connected to my body. So there we go. There's already something happening beyond my perception of myself, which is my body. And, I guess we can just keep taking it layers and layers deeper. I mean, into the psyche and then into all the other things that are whatever our energy fields are connected with. So we really are interconnected with everything. And then there's just on the very surface of that, just the sense of what it's like to be Matt Goodman or Jaime Pineda.
Absolutely. I think that's an important insight. Yeah.
Yeah. I want to ask you about one more thing before we wrap up. You write in the book that you're working on now about what you refer to as self-parenting the mind. Mm-hmm. What do you mean by that, and why is that important to do?
Yeah, I think self-parenting simply refers to being kind to yourself, learning to love yourself, right? And a lot of us acquired that from our parents, right? Their loving kindness towards us showed us that we were loved, and we grew up with that kind of thing. But many of us didn't experience that kind of good parenting. And so there's a possibility of recovering some of that by doing your own self-parenting, loving yourself to the point where you recover that part of you that's missing. And I think a lot of people, before they really get into meditation, need to do a lot of that. So part of seeing a therapist is part of that. A therapist is part of the self-parenting that we do, right? So you need to take care of some issues uh, before you really get into the meditation.
I've always been of the mindset that, like, as far as starting a meditation practice in our culture in the West, and then just in the current time that we live in, um, our mind, we really have such a hard time with self-acceptance and self-compassion and unconditional love. And I know that this is a universal human thing that has been there since whenever ego came to be, in the psyche, but so much so today. So I'm definitely a proponent of the idea of kind of like front loading the meditation practice with a lot of these self-kindness, self-love practices. I think it helps to soften a little bit when we do start down, and when we do sit down and start to practice mindfulness, to be able to have some of those muscles built already, to be able, it helps us to observe our experiences with a little bit more compassion, a little bit more kindly.
No, I agree. And, however you arrange that, whether you front load it or do it simultaneously, I would recommend everybody do self-parenting, do self-loving kindness and all that kind of compassionate kinds of meditations. It's helpful. I was talking about people who actually need it more than others, right? That they really should focus on that first and then move on. But you can do it simultaneously as well.
Sure.
So yeah, so it's an aspect of just taking care of your body, of yourself, of your psyche, and so that you're ready for this other thing.
Yeah. Jaime, is there anything else that we haven't talked about today that you would like to share with us? This has been a very eye-opening conversation.
Not that I can think of. I think it was pretty comprehensive. It was very comprehensive, and I enjoyed it. So yeah, I can't think of anything with it.
Fantastic. Great. Where can people discover you? I know you have a blog, you have books. Let me just read the name of one of your books. It's called Piercing the Cloud, Discovering the Real Me. This is a memoir. It's on Amazon. You have another textbook coming out, I believe, which is called The Social Impulse. Do I have that right?
Yeah.
Social Impulse.
Yeah.
Cool. Cool.
I also have a couple of books of poetry that are on Amazon. And really, the poetry is also an attempt to give these sort of lessons in poetic form, right? So they're short, insightful things that I've experienced that take people in this journey. So that's one other possibility. People might want to look at that book of poetry. It's called The Quieting of the Mind and The Dawning of a New Mind. So it's 2 books.
Fantastic. Thank you again for having this conversation. I'm glad we could finally have it. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, it's great talking to you.